Welcome back. As we've been communicating, there's been an enormous backlash to the news that Zimbabwe's re-elected President Emmerson Mnagagwa has appointed his son, 34-year-old David Mnangagwa, to serve as the country's finance deputy minister, while the president's nephew, Tongai Mnangagwa, was named deputy minister of tourism and hospitality. This decision is part of the newly constituted cabinet consisting of 26 ministries. The unprecedented condemnation of the Zimbabwean elections by the SADC Electoral Observation Mission was viewed as a reawakening of the regional bodies on the fault lines in African democracies post the colonial era. Today's special focus is on democracies in the Southern African Development Community, or Sadak. And to discuss this further, we are now joined by political analyst Jamie Mighti. Jamie, a very good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning to you and good morning to the viewers.
I mean, this is clearly a blatant issue of nepotism. What do you make of that?
Well, the first thing that we need to note here is that this adds insult to injury to the democratic crisis in Zimbabwe, because in the first instance, you have the SADC observer mission saying that this election did not meet the standards for free and fair election and that there were multiple irregularities. And you have other observer missions saying effectively the same thing, that the election was not free and fair, both at the process before the election and in and of itself on election day. Then, when you have this credibility crisis already, where only 3 African presidents attend the inauguration, and you have, global criticism of the election, the president then decides that he is going to include family members into his cabinet. I think if we look at Tongai Mnangagwa, who has been appointed as the Minister of Finance and Economic Development, there are some issues there, right? The first one is that he wasn't even elected on a clean ticket, which is to say he came in as a quota for the youth quota, because there are quotas in the Zimbabwean parliament. So first and foremost, you did not even win a constituency seat. You came in basically via a back door. Yes. And then the second thing is the age is a factor, because these are the type of cabinet positions. Finance is a very serious position where you need a lot of gravitas, you need a lot of international track record in this particular sector, and he does not have that. To his defense, however, he does have actuarial science training. He did work at AON in America whilst he was there. But the relationship with the president and the accusations which came out of the gold mafia make it such that people have to be highly skeptical of this appointment, because in the gold mafia documentary, what was revealed is that there were attempts by the president and people around him to funnel money which was being got from gold trading, and to be able to get that money cleaned and laundered. So when you have been implicated in those kind of accusations at a global level by credible international institutions, to then say, I'm going to put my son right next to the supervision of that is a real issue. What
does the law say then about nepotism?
It's a dictatorship.
Is there a law around that particular subject, or he's simply exercising his carte blanche or his right to appoint whoever he wants?
It's a dictatorship. He does have the powers to do that.
Okay.
But in the constitutional provisions, he does have the powers to do that. But this speaks at this particular point to the quality and credibility of the democracy, because it is nepotism. Even if he does have an actuarial science degree, it is not foreseeable or credible or reasonable to presume that he is the only person in Zimbabwe and in the Zimbabwean diaspora who has the qualifications and expertise to be able to assist the the minister. What it seems here is that the president has put someone who he can trust to look and supervise the money.
Remember that a couple of years ago, President Mnangagwa was heavily criticized, for having passed laws that sought to make changes with regards to the election of deputy presidents. And he also decided that senior judges will now be appointed by the president in consultation with the Judicial Service Commission. And so many of his detractors accused him of trying to concentrate power on the presidency. Are they correct?
I think that there is a lot of ground to accept that criticism, because when you look holistically at the conduct of President Emmerson Mnagangwa, it does seem as if he is trying to, one, extend the influence of his family, and number two, extend the duration of his stay in power. In fact, the appointment of his relatives to these cabinet positions could be a strategy, because one of the things I didn't get a chance to mention is that Sean Mnangagwa, another one of his sons, works in the Presidential Guard, and he's a member and a commander in the military. So if you then think that you've got a Deputy Minister of Tourism, a Deputy Minister of Finance, and you've got your son in the Presidential Guard, that almost indicates that there's an agenda to either extend your term of office or to create a lane that your family members can then assume power in the event that you're unable to. Going to the judge issue now, one of the things that happened is that there were supposed to be public interviews for senior judicial positions, and that was then rescinded, and then that prerogative was just given to the president, and that was where the constitutional dispute was, because the people were saying, we want to see how these judges perform in public interview processes, in a process similar to what we see in South Africa, but that was taken away. And in addition, there was this extension of the duration of the stay of a judge in terms of the retirement age.
To 75 years.
To 75 years. The concern there was if these judges were captured by the Mugabe or Mnangagwa era, right, you are actually trying to prevent credible judges who may not be, you know, within your nexus of influence from getting into those critical positions. And that in and of itself indicates an attempt to strengthen the power of the dictatorship and the power of the regime. And I call it that because we have to pull away this veneer that there is a credible democracy in Zimbabwe. There has not been.
And in that instance, where does that leave the separation of powers and the integrity of the judiciary?
It undermines it, but let's be very clear that there hasn't really been much, even under the Mugabe era. This country, Zimbabwe, has been a dictatorship for a very long time. And it has been one of those dictatorships which operate as faux democracies, which is to say they put on the pretense of democracy. But when it comes to the hard fundamentals, you will quickly find out that it is a military regime run by a violent political party, the ZANU-PF.
Now, back to the issue of the appointment of his family members into decision-making structures, in particular the cabinet. There was much outrage, and people were so outraged at the announcement of such a decision. But is outrage enough? What powers do the people have in terms of addressing their concerns when it comes to the running of the country?
The people don't have a lot of power, and if you look at this, it happens across African brutal regimes and dictatorships. If you think about how long it took to remove Omar al-Bashir, if you look at Gabon, how long the Bongo family was in power, 56 years. If you look at Equatorial Guinea, if you look across the continent, even Cameroon, where you have these long-standing dictatorships, it's very hard for the people to remove them. In Cameroon, the people tried to fight back, and there was a violent, brutal response from the government there. So the people are powerless, but I think what can happen is that the international community can implement pressure on the ZANU-PF government for some form of reform. And actually right now there needs to be a Sadak tribunal or an emergency extraordinary meeting on the crisis in Zimbabwe, because it's not genuine of us to say these people who don't have rights to bear arms, who are not able to organize, who are not able to exercise their political rights, are going to be able to fight a regime that can shoot them in the streets with live ammunition. If you remember in August of 2018, when the people marched in Harare protesting the delay in the announcement of election results, the army came out and shot them in front of the international media. And I'm sure there were some SABC journalists who were there on that day, and they were surprised because that is stuff that you do not even see in many parts of Africa. That is how unrepentant and uncaring the regime is. So the people of Zimbabwe right now are in a very weak position because they have a gun that is being pointed at them at all times by this military regime. And it will take a lot of international pressure for the ZANU-PF to actually make any amendments or changes. Or at the end of the day, all it will take for there to be a change is if the military gets bored with the economic conditions and decides to go the Gabon route or the Burkina Faso route or the Mali route. Outside of that, right now, the people of Zimbabwe have no credible pathway to changing that government or the state of the nation.
I'm actually glad that you touched on the coup in Mali, and we've just heard recent reports that there's been another, potential coup in Congo, but we'll discuss that in a moment. But I want us to talk about the role of Sadak in terms of the condemnation and the criticism of the outcome of the Zimbabwe elections. So what do you make of the fierce and unequivocal criticism of how the elections played out?
Well, for the first time, I was actually impressed by Sadak, because for multiple elections, they turned the other cheek, so to speak. They recognized irregularities, but they did not make strong and forceful statements. So this was the first time that Sadak actually said, look, we're going to draw the line. And I think the fact that Sadak did that when these countries in the region have strong relationships with Zimbabwe and they have been protecting Zimbabwe for a long time, I think sent a strong message. So I think Sadak, in terms of the observer mission, played its first role. What needs to happen now is that there needs to be an extraordinary summit of SADC to actually try to see what are the next steps if they are going to follow through on the underlining principle which they said in their observer mission, which is that we need to have free and credible elections in the region. One of the things that I like about ECOWAS is that they do not hesitate to condemn coups, right? Unfortunately, there are other dynamics there, but I've always thought that it's bold that ECOWAS will come out and say, we don't want coups in our region. And I think we need to get to a point where SADC can be very clear to say, we don't want unfair elections in our region. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think that the fact that the SADC Observer Mission said that was, I think it was a strike at the heart of the narrative that ZANU-PF keeps having to say they are running free and fair elections.
More especially because the head of the Observer Mission, Neves Muba, said that SADC is a well-oiled machine. But it begs the question, is it really a well-oiled machine? I mean, what's the point of having SADC as the regional body when it cannot be listened to, especially when it comes to condemnation and criticizing of, unfree and unfair elections?
To be diplomatic, let's say that was an aspirational statement,
yes,
because the experience of most Africans, especially young Africans, is not that SADC is a well-oiled machine. I think what needs to happen now is that the presidents of the nations within the SADC bloc need to back the institution of SADC, because what has happened a little bit is that there has been an undermining of the election observer report, and that can weaken the status of SADC, because future election runners will say, it doesn't even matter if SADC says this election was not free and fair, because all of my friends will come to my inauguration and I will continue to appoint my children to cabinet positions. But in terms of the status of SADC, I don't think that they are relevant to the lives of many Africans. It's not the European Union Parliament or anything like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that needs to be done by both SADC and the AU.
Let's move further north. We do understand that Mali has taken a decision to cancel all its colonial era agreements it had with its former colonial master, France. So what do you make of that? Because apparently they're saying that it's a flagrant violation of its sovereignty, especially with the violation of their troops there.
France has been undermining Africa for a very long time, and they've particularly been doing that in what is known as Francophone Africa. They've been doing it in a variety of ways through the use of, the Francophone currency, through the West African franc and the Central African franc. These currency agreements have made it such that these Francophone countries have not been able to control their monetary policy. They've made it such that France is able to get resources from them very cheaply, and France basically is able to control the purse of 15 African countries. That's number one. The other side of the equation is that France has been able to impose itself militarily in that part of the world, to have military bases, to try and influence foreign policy decisions made by those particular countries. But over the course of 60 years, what we've seen very troubling is that France has backed dictators, it has backed bad leaders who were favorable to France, giving French companies, carte blanche to operate in that part of the world, but not benefiting the people. So when you look at the developments happening in West Africa, in particularly the Francophone countries, they are welcome. It's very important for us to be very honest about what France has done.
Yes.
The fall of leaders such as Thomas Sankara was because he stood up to how France was trying to manipulate leadership in the region. And at that point where he was doing that, they orchestrated, along with other countries and along with inside collaborators, the assassination of Thomas Sankara.
Do you see a domino effect in the other Francophone countries? I mean, they're taking the same route of cancelling whatever agreement that exists between their former colonial masters.
I think the geopolitical moment that is happening right now is going to be such that France is the biggest loser in West Africa. I do see that trend. Yeah. And if you look at the rhetoric coming out of Burkina Faso, the rhetoric coming out of Niger, Mali, but not only those countries, other countries in the region, it's such that it is now matching the rhetoric of what the people have been saying for a long time, and the academics, because it's not like France has not been criticized before. It's now that the leaders of these coups and the leaders of these militaries are now saying the same thing that the people and academics have been saying, which is that it's time for Franc-Afrique, which is France in Africa, to end. So I do see a pattern, and I do think that France will be the biggest loser in the geopolitical renegotiation within Africa.
All right, and we certainly cannot overemphasize the dominance and the influence that China has in Africa in terms of undermining the dominance of the West on the African states. Jamie, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you. Well, that was political analyst Jamie Mighti. He was sharing his perspectives on how democracies in the Southern African Development Community, Sadak, have performed post the colonial era. Now, this is on the back of the current developments in Zimbabwe.